Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Aparna Vatve, faculty of Tata Institute of Social Sciences. This module is about common property resources in India. It is part of the paper Environment and Society. In this module, we will mainly look at what have been the common property resources in India. We will take a look at N.S. Jodha's work on this subject. The relationship between common property resources and poverty will be explored. In the end, we will talk about the efforts of preservation of common property areas in India. The term common property resources is widely used in the research, but many researchers give a very different meaning to the term. Each has its own view. According to some scientists, all resources that are not private property should be treated as common property. But other researchers believe that a resource becomes a common property only when there is a very well established and well defined group of people who have the right to its collective use. The rules that govern their use are set out clearly and followed universally. This second approach gives a very strict definition, and in many cases, resources which are used in common cannot be considered as common property resources by this definition. Common property resource means existence of an institutional arrangement for management of the resources. In 1980s, N.S. Jodha, a renowned scientist, undertook a very large study. He looked at semi-arid areas of India and looked at common property resources in the region and people's dependence on them. Aim of this study was to understand pattern of household level dependence on private and common property resources. Water, fodder, non-timber forest produce were the common property resources mainly included in this study. This was undertaken in 7 states of India. All of them were in the arid or semi-arid zone. Many types of common property resources were documented in this study. A village may have river, pond or lake. The entire watershed of the village can be considered as common property area. Perennial springs are very important sources of water for people in the mountain areas. These springs are governed as common property resource. There are social and cultural sanctions which decide how the spring water will be shared. These are managed by the community because they are extremely important in the dry period. Canals, irrigation channels, wells, roads are all examples of newly created common resources which can be seen in any area. Village ponds and river are often used for fishing. They are also used by rural artisans to carry out their own household level activities. Potters require soil around ponds. They also require water from the village pond to make the pots. Artisans need water bodies for rope making and creation of bamboo handicrafts. Leather workers require it for preparation of hide. These households are extremely poor. They have no access to private resources for getting water. For these households, common property resources are required to carry out livelihood activities. In the eastern Vidarbha region of Maharashtra, communities created water bodies for diverse purposes. There was an informal village committee. This committee would appoint one person known as Pankar to ensure the upkeep and equitable distribution of water. In Ladakh, water is available only when the glaciers melt during summer. This water is diverted through a very well kept system of canals, and it is shared by households for agriculture. Knowledgeable persons were appointed by the villagers to regulate the water flows. This was a most respectable position. The people had knowledge for several generations, and they were trusted by the villagers. Threshing grounds are lands which are common in the village. These lands are used for keeping of grains, threshing out the grain, drying, grinding of the grains, and ultimately for storing of grains. They are used by all the farmers together. The large farmers or the rich farmers might have their own private lands to do this. But these grounds are very important for the subsistence farmers who do not have enough private property land. Coastal beaches are very important for the coastal villages. Fishing community requires beaches for mending the boats. Landing and sorting of fish catch happens on the beaches. These are areas where cleaning and drying of fish is carried out. Village grazing land or pasture land was a special category. In local languages, they were known as gauchers, gochers, or gairans. These terms were even documented in the official land use records. Even during British times, gairans were identified as a special land use. Laws gave villagers right to use the permanent pasture. In many places, these grazing lands became designated as wastelands. This was a mistake. These lands came under the administration of Revenue Department or Forest Department. Many times, the government agencies gave away these lands to private companies or individuals. These lands could be acquired for industrial development, forestry purposes, or growth of urban areas, and they were given away at a very low price. Today, there is a lot of importance given to dairy. Livestock keeping is promoted. Cattle and goat and sheep are distributed by government as a part of livelihood generation activities. But there is scarcity of fodder, as many of the grazing lands are not available anymore. They have been converted to something else. In 2015 and 16, large parts of India faced a drought. This drought was very serious because it was a drought of fodder. There was just no enough fodder available for the village livestock. In the late 20th century, many social activists demanded land for the landless people. Actually, they were asking for redistribution of productive lands. But government in many places gave away common grazing lands to people. These lands were not productive enough. Large investments were needed to make these lands productive. Poor people who got it could not invest in it. Sometimes they cultivated minor crops. Most times they had to let it lie fallow. In the end, these lands were taken away by other developers. Findings of Jodha's study were really striking. His research showed that rural poor are highly dependent on common property resources. They need it for various activities of livelihood. All of the rural poor require common grazing lands, and they require fuel from the common forest areas. Another observation of Jodha's was that women in rural area are the sufferers when it comes to loss of common property areas. Women are in charge of water, fuel wood, food, and fodder collection. Degradation makes life much harder for the women. They are the biggest stakeholders in the conservation of common property resources. Alternatives such as migration or wage labor are not possible for women in most cases. They have to remain home and they have to manage with whatever natural resources are available on the common lands. Programs of common property resource management and eradication of poverty ensure that women have equal participation in the program. Today, in many areas, rural women have asserted their rights over resources. They have organized social movements to claim water, land and forest resources. Jodha observed that one of the major causes of rural poverty is degradation of common property resources. He suggested formation of user groups that can be empowered to manage the resources. So far in this module, we have looked at what are the different types of common property resources in rural parts of India. We also looked at the landmark work by Jodha and his conclusions about how poverty and common property resources are linked. Jodha's study led to many other studies on patterns of common property resource use in India. These studies showed that access was regulated by culture. Access to common resources could be based on being born in a certain caste or in certain religion or certain occupation-based community. Castes in social hierarchy claim most of the village resources. They claim the best of the resources. But at the same time, the castes which are considered lower in the social hierarchy have less access to resources. They can access only the poorest of the lands and the most unclean of the water sources. The access could also be limited to people from a certain area. It is very commonly seen that in Indian villages there are many small hamlets. Each hamlet or each settlement could have its own resources. If two hamlets have overlapping resources, there will be conflict. Access could also be divided as per the needs of livelihood. In one village, potters will be using one end of the pond, fishermen will be using other part of the pond, and the hide workers will be using another part of it. All these activities can be carried out separately but in the same place because there are cultural divisions of how the resource should be managed. In the past, common property resource areas were protected and managed by the local people. They had their own governance systems. In some cases, they were unequal governance systems. In some cases, the systems of governance were not fair to all. When the government took over the resources, they did not take opinion of the local communities. Government started to make decision about common resources without consulting the local people. This created many problems. In the pre-colonial period, that is before the coming of the British, most of the natural resources were freely available to the rural population. They were under the control of the local communities or village chiefs, or in certain cases, the kings of the area. The kings did have their own areas for hunting or for pleasure activities. But in most cases, they understood that local people will be governing their own areas. They did not interfere in most cases. In the colonial period, extension of state control took place between 1850s to 1947. In this period, community management systems were weakened. The common property resources declined substantially. People were no more interested in maintaining the resource. In spite of this, common property resources play an important role in the life and economy of rural people. During the colonial period, government tried to control land as well as forest. Declaration of reserved and protected forest excluded people. Rights of the people became limited to private property or cultivated lands. Most of the landless people had no land holdings and some had very small land holdings. Few rights were legally recognized. Later, even the legally recognized rights were downgraded or even extinguished. Systems of community management disintegrated except in very rare cases. In the post-independence period, most of the princely states were abolished. India became one country. The control of the central government and the state government extended everywhere. Only in case of Northeast, the situation was different. In the Northeast Indian states, communities continue to hold control over their common lands. But in other parts of India, even in tribal areas, most lands except the cultivated lands belong to the revenue department or to the forest department. In the dry, rain-fed plains areas of India, common property resources are especially important. In this area, the rainfall is less, it is erratic, and there is no guarantee of production of crops. In these cases, supplementary activities like livestock rearing can be taken up by people, and that can help in livelihoods. They also act as a defense against the risk of drought. Today, climate change is changing the way crops are produced in India. Environmental change is affecting all livelihood activities. Lands are already degraded, and people have to once again move towards common areas for sustenance. Today, in addition to the land degradation, there is almost complete breakdown of community control. Most areas which were actually common property resource are today turned into open access. That means there is no control of anyone over which resources are extracted from them or in what quantity. It is very difficult for the actual owner or even the state to control the resource use in the open areas. The quality as well as quantity of products that were once available from the common lands is today gone. In many areas, women have to walk hours just to find enough fuel wood. There is also an increasing class differentiation which leads to increased conflicts. Common property resources are not limited only to the rural areas. We can see their examples in urban areas. We have to remember that most urban areas of India were once upon a time rural areas. When a rural area is converted into a city, the rural commons also get converted. Most of the times, the rural commons then become government lands. Public parks and gardens is one example of urban commons. In many areas, there are hills within the city. There is also forest in the urban areas. All these are examples of urban common property resource. Natural as well as man-made tanks and water bodies can be seen in many areas. Roads and public spaces is another common property in the cities. The transformation of rural commons into urban commons also changes it. The case of Bengaluru lakes in Karnataka is representative of what problems are faced by urban commons. Once upon a time, Bengaluru was city of lakes. The lakes in Bengaluru city were used by the people for fishing and bathing. In the last century, development of Bengaluru lakes was started by the government agencies. They adopted a PPP model. PPP model is public-private partnership model. Through this model, companies took over lake development work with the permission of the government. Each company had its own view. They transformed the public lakes into fenced-off gardens and parks. The traditional users who used to live just around the lakes were excluded. They had to pay to get in. Very soon, they lost all interest in accessing the lakes. The lakes were then given on contracts for fishing. Many kinds of wrong, ecologically incorrect practices soon led to degradation of the lakes. In India, common property institutions are rooted in social systems. In the past, communities used to work together and live together for basic survival. Today, the strong bonds that linked an individual to the community are broken. Individuals move out of traditional systems. It is a natural process. It is today difficult to expect cultural practices of resource use to continue just as they were in the past. We need to create new cultural practices which will help us to manage the commons. Colonization, law, policy are all responsible for the process of change. Changes in the education system changed the way people interacted with different communities. In modern India, focus is more on individual rather than on the community. The history of use or abuse of resource in India can be also traced as the history of rise and decline of community institutions. Impact of Jodha study still continues. It renewed interest in the common property resource management. Many poverty elimination programs borrowed idea from Jodha. Local institutions were promoted in the village watershed and integrated development programs. Various laws have today given legal support to ensure the rights of the poor over the common property resources. The idea of resource user committee was later taken up by the government programs. Watershed Management Committee, Joint Forest Management Committee are all examples of new institutions. There are many important changes in the governance of common resources. Panchayats have been given the duty and responsibility of managing common pool resources in the village. In the scheduled area, provisions were made for the Gram Sabhas to gain rights of resource management based on customary law. This is applicable in most tribal areas. In this module, we looked at common property resources in rural and urban India. We also looked at Jodha's study, which told us many things about rural poverty, the poverty of the women, and common property resources. In the end, we looked at the various factors which are responsible for the status of common property resources. I hope you have enjoyed this module. You can learn more about this by reading our e-text. You can also take a look at the essential reading section, which has many books and papers which give information about this topic. Thank you so much for joining us. Hope to see you again.